Tonight, the Caribbean isn't just dark, it's dangerous. US warships are moving. Venezuela is on edge, and the world is one mistake away from a crisis that could change history forever. Night falls heavy over the Caribbean. The sea black as oil, broken only by the ghostly silhouettes of US warships slicing through the waves. Their lights blink in the darkness, a silent warning to anyone watching from the Venezuelan coast. Onshore, families huddle in cramped apartments, the distant thrum of engines echoing through the humid air. Mothers hush their children, eyes darting to flickering televisions. Waiting for any news. Suddenly the screen crackles to life. A stern-faced Venezuelan general appears, his medals glinting under harsh studio lights. His voice is cold, unwavering. We will defend our sovereignty with every drop of our blood. Any incursion will be met with force. The words hang in the air, heavy as thunder. In the streets of Caracas, the message is replayed on radios. Whispered in crowded markets, scrawled in graffiti on battered walls. Fear and pride mingle in every heartbeat. Across the ocean in Washington, a different kind of tension simmers. In the West Wing, a White House official taps out a tweet, fingers trembling with the weight of history. The message is brief, almost casual. All options are on the table. Within minutes, the world is watching. News anchors scramble for updates, analysts argue over maps, and hashtags explode across social media. Hashtag Venezuela crisis. Hashtag redline. Hash standoff. In Miami, exiles gather in living rooms, clutching phones, praying for family left behind. In Moscow, diplomats lean over encrypted calls, voices low and urgent. Oil prices spike, markets shudder, and somewhere, a child asks her mother why the soldiers look so scared. The air is thick with dread and anticipation. Every second feels stretched, electric, as if the world itself is holding its breath. The border is more than a line on a map tonight. It's a fuse, burning towards something no one can quite name. But what neither side expected was just how close the world would come to the brink. Rewind the clock. The world didn't arrive at this moment by accident. For weeks, the tension had been building, each day a new headline, each night a new fear. It began with the tightening of sanctions, Washington's answer to a regime it called illegitimate. Overnight, Venezuela's lifeline to the world was choked. Banks froze assets, companies pulled out, and the price of bread doubled in a single week. In Caracas, mothers lined up before dawn, hoping for a bag of rice or a few eggs. Fathers pawned wedding rings for medicine. Children learned to sleep through the rumble of distant protests and the sharp crack of gunfire. On the other side of the world, oil tankers became pawns in a high-stakes chess game. U.S. Navy ships shadowed Venezuelan vessels, intercepting some, turning others away. Each seizure was a message. The world is watching, and no one is untouchable. But for every tanker stopped, 1,000 families lost hope. Factories shuttered, lights flickered out, and the city that once danced to the rhythm of salsa now moved to the beat of uncertainty. The leaders, meanwhile, played their parts with theatrical precision. In Caracas, Nicolas Maduro stood before a sea of red flags, his voice booming through loudspeakers. We will not bow to imperialists. Venezuela is sovereign. His words drew cheers from loyalists, but in the shadows, even his supporters wondered how much longer the country could endure. In Washington, the president's tone was colder, more calculated. The Maduro regime is a threat to democracy and stability. All options remain on the table. The world heard the threat behind the words, the promise of action. But the crisis was never just about two men. In Miami, Venezuelan exiles watched the news with clenched fists, their WhatsApp groups buzzing with rumors and prayers. Some had fled with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, now haunted by the faces of loved ones left behind. In Houston, oil executives stared at plunging stock prices, their fortunes tied to a conflict they could not control. In Beijing and Moscow, diplomats weighed their next moves. Knowing that every decision could tip the balance of power, markets trembled. The price of oil soared, then crashed, then soared again. Investors panicked, and pensioners watched their savings shrink. In the chaos, ordinary people paid the highest price. A grandmother in Maracaibo sold her last heirloom to buy insulin. A young man in New York sent half his paycheck home, knowing it might not be enough. Everyone thought this was just another diplomatic spat. They were wrong. Nicolas Maduro was not born into power. He was a child of the barrios, raised on the edge of Caracas, where the city's glittering skyline gave way to a maze of tin roofs and broken dreams. His father was a union man, his mother a school teacher. Young Nicholas drove a city bus, winding through the chaos of traffic and poverty, learning the language of the street. He was a man of the people, or so the story went. But the story changed. When Hugo Chavez, the firebrand who promised a Bolivarian revolution, took Maduro under his wing, everything shifted. Maduro became the loyal apprentice, the quiet shadow at Chavez's side. He watched, he listened, he learned. When Chavez fell ill, it was Maduro who stood at the hospital bedside, who wept on national television, who swore to carry the torch. And when Chavez died, it was Maduro who inherited the revolution and the storm that came with it. At first, he tried to wear the mantle of the people's champion. He spoke of justice, of dignity, of a Venezuela for all. But the world was changing, and so was Maduro. The price of oil collapsed, the economy buckled, and the streets filled with anger. Maduro's speeches grew louder, his promises more desperate. He blamed foreign saboteurs, greedy businessmen, and the imperialist North. He called himself the son of Chavez, the defender of the revolution, the last line of defense against chaos. But as the crisis deepened, Maduro's mask began to slip. He surrounded himself with generals and loyalists, men who owed their fortunes to his favor. He cracked down on dissent with an iron fist. Protesters were met with tear gas and rubber bullets. Journalists vanished. Judges who ruled against the government found themselves in exile. Worse, the National Assembly, once a symbol of democracy, was stripped of its power. Elections became theater, the outcome never in doubt. Still, Maduro stood before the cameras, his voice booming, his fists raised. "We will never surrender," he thundered, as if sheer will could hold back the tide of hunger and fear. He danced on stage at rallies, waving the flag, surrounded by a shrinking circle of true believers. He mocked the opposition, calling them puppets of Washington, traitors to the nation. He laughed off international condemnation, dismissing sanctions as badges of honor. Yet outside the palace gates, the suffering was impossible to ignore. In the hospitals, doctors begged for antibiotics and clean water. In the markets, mothers wept over empty shelves. Children fainted in classrooms, their stomachs empty. The once proud oil fields lay silent, rusting in the sun. The revolution that promised dignity now delivered only despair. Maduro's arrogance became legend. He boasted of eating rabbit stew while his people starved. He claimed to commune with the spirit of Chavez, to receive guidance from beyond the grave. He staged elaborate parades, rolling tanks through the streets, as if military might could fill the void left by broken promises. He surrounded himself with portraits of Bolivar and Chavez, as if their ghosts could shield him from the truth. But even as he projected strength, cracks began to show. Loyalists whispered of defections. Generals grew restless. The currency collapsed, and with it the illusion of control. Maduro lashed out, blaming everyone but himself. He accused aid workers of plotting coups, accused neighbors of sabotage, accused the world of conspiracy, and yet, in rare, unguarded moments, the mask slipped. Cameras caught him glancing nervously at his advisors, his eyes darting to the shadows. He knew the world was watching. He knew the revolution was slipping through his fingers. But pride would not let him yield. He doubled down, convinced that only he could save Venezuela even as the country crumbled around him. But behind the palace walls, Maduro's grip was slipping in, the world was watching. Juan Guaido was born in the coastal city of La Guaira, where the sea meets the mountains and the air is thick with salt and hope. His childhood was marked by the rhythms of ordinary Venezuelan life, soccer in the streets, laughter in the markets, the scent of arepas drifting from kitchen windows. But beneath the surface, there was always a sense of fragility. When the floods came in 1999, they swept away homes, dreams, and nearly his own family. Guido learned early that survival in Venezuela meant resilience, and that hope was not a luxury, but a necessity. His parents, both public servants, taught him the value of service and sacrifice. His mother, a teacher, would spend her evenings tutoring neighborhood children for free, believing that education was the only true path to freedom. His father, an airline pilot, was often away, but when he returned, he brought stories of a world beyond Venezuela's borders, a world where justice was not just a word but a promise. These stories planted seeds in young Juan, seeds that would one day grow into conviction. As a teenager, Guido watched his country change. He saw friends leave for distant shores, chasing opportunities that no longer existed at home. He saw neighbors grow thin, their faces lined with worry. He saw the rise of Chavez, the hope, and then the disappointment, the promises, and then the betrayals. He felt the weight of a nation's dreams slipping away. He refused to let them go quietly. At university, Guido found his voice. He joined the student movement, marching in the streets, demanding accountability, risking arrest for the simple act of speaking out. He learned to organize, to inspire, to lead. He faced tear gas and rubber bullets, but he never backed down. His courage was not the bluster of a strong man, but the quiet determination of someone who knows what is at stake. He saw friends disappear, some never to return. And he carried their memory like a shield. Guido's rise was not meteoric, but it was relentless. He built alliances across the fractured opposition, earning trust not with grand promises, but with honesty and humility. He listened to the stories of mothers who had lost children to hunger, of fathers who had lost jobs to corruption, of students who had lost hope to fear. He made their struggles his own, and in doing so, became more than a politician. He became a symbol. His family paid the price for his convictions. His wife Fabiana stood by him through threats and intimidation, raising their young daughter in a world where danger was never far away. His mother wept in private, fearing for her son's life, but never once asked him to stop. Guido's home was raided, his friends arrested, his every move watched. Yet he pressed on, fueled by a belief that Venezuela deserved better. In 2019, the world took notice. The National Assembly, the last vestige of democracy in a country sliding toward dictatorship, named Guido its president. He stood on a makeshift stage in Caracas, hand raised, and declared himself interim president of Venezuela. The crowd erupted not just in hope, but in defiance. For the first time in years, the people saw a path forward, however narrow, however dangerous. International recognition followed. The United States, the European Union, and dozens of countries threw their support behind Guido. He became the face of a movement, the voice of a silenced nation. But with recognition came risk. Maduro's regime branded him a traitor, a puppet, a criminal. He faced arrest, exile, even death. Yet he refused to flee. "We are not leaving," he told his supporters. "We are staying to fight for our country." Guido's strength was never in his power, but in his vulnerability. He spoke not as a savior, but as a son, a husband, a father, one of millions who had lost so much but who still believed in the promise of Venezuela. He walked among the people, not above them. He listened, he learned, he led. His rallies were not just political events, but gatherings of hope where the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the exiled and the forgotten, came together to remember what it meant to be Venezuelan. He knew the risks. He knew the cost. But he also knew that history was watching, and that the world was waiting for someone to stand up and say, "Enough." Guido became that someone not because he sought power, but because he could not bear to see his country suffer any longer. And it was these very struggles that would prepare him for the ultimate showdown. The world snapped back to the present, and the air was electric with tension. On the Caribbean horizon, US warships cut through the surf, their decks bristling with aircraft and missiles. The Pentagon called it a routine exercise, but no one believed it. Venezuelan soldiers watched from battered outposts, their nerves frayed, their radios alive with rumors. In the capital, the streets pulsed with anxiety. Caracas was a city on edge, its people caught between hope and dread. Then came the roar of engines overhead. Russian bombers, painted with red stars, thundered into Caracas, slicing through the clouds and sending a message that echoed far beyond Venezuela's borders. Cameras captured the spectacle. Foreign pilots saluting Maduro on the tarmac. The Venezuelan president grinning for the world to see. It was a show of defiance, a signal that he was not alone. The message was clear. This was no longer just a local struggle. The world's great powers were now in the ring. The media descended like a storm. Reporters from every continent jostled for position, broadcasting live from the city's plazas and barricades. Headlines screamed of a new Cold War, of proxy battles and red lines. Social media feeds filled with images of tanks rolling through the streets, crowds waving flags, of children peering from behind shuttered windows. The world watched, transfixed, as the crisis deepened. Mad, emboldened by his new allies, doubled down. He appeared on television, flanked by generals, his voice thunderous. Venezuela will never surrender. We are not afraid of imperialists or their puppets. His supporters rallied in the streets, waving banners and chanting slogans. But beneath the bravado, there was fear. The regime's grip was tightening, but so was the pressure from within. Guido answered with a call to action. He stood before a sea of faces, his voice steady, his resolve unshaken. This is our moment. We will not be silenced. On Sunday, we march for our future, for our children, for our dignity. The words spread like wildfire. Across the country, people began to gather: students, workers, mothers, the old and the young. They carried homemade signs and battered flags, their eyes shining with defiance. The world saw a nation rising, unbowed by fear. In Washington, the stakes were raised yet again. The White House issued a stark ultimatum. The Maduro regime has 72 hours to step aside and allow for a peaceful transition. All options remain on the table. The words reverberated through diplomatic channels, igniting debate in capitals from Paris to Beijing. Was this a bluff, or the prelude to something far more dangerous? The tension was palpable. Every hour brought new rumors, new threats, new possibilities. Oil prices spiked, then crashed. Embassies evacuated staff. The world's attention was fixed on Venezuela, a nation teetering on the edge of chaos. In the barrios, families huddled together, praying for peace, but bracing for the worst. In the palaces and boardrooms, leaders weighed their next moves, knowing that a single misstep could unleash disaster. But then, a single incident threatened to ignite the powder keg. The world watched as the border became a stage for history. On one side, convoys of humanitarian aid trucks loaded with food, medicine, and hope waited to cross into Venezuela. On the other, soldiers in riot gear formed a human wall. Their faces hidden behind black visors, their orders clear. Nothing gets through. The air was thick with tension, the eyes of millions glued to their screens, waiting for a sign of mercy, of violence, of change. Then chaos erupted. A single shot rang out, echoing across the bridge. Tear gas canisters arced through the air, hissing as they landed among the crowds. Protesters scattered, coughing and blinded, but some pressed forward, desperate to reach the aid. Suddenly, flames leaped skyward. One of the aid trucks, its cargo meant for starving families, was engulfed in fire. The blaze was captured from every angle by drones, by cell phones, by international news crews. The world saw the smoke, the panic, the heartbreak. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag aid on fire. Hashtag Venezuela SOS. Hash who burned the aid. In the chaos, Guaido emerged. He stood atop a makeshift platform, his face streaked with sweat and resolve. The crowd surged around him, battered but unbroken. Cameras zoomed in as he raised a trembling hand, his voice cutting through the noise. They can burn our food, but they cannot burn our hope. They can block our medicine, but they cannot block our future. Today, the world sees who stands for life and who stands for fear. His words ricocheted across the globe. Within minutes, The speech was everywhere, on WhatsApp, on the lips of exiles and students and mothers. In Miami, tears streamed down the faces of families watching on their phones. In Madrid, Venezuelan flags waved from balconies. In Caracas, even those who had lost faith felt a flicker of something they thought was gone. Possibility. But the drama was only beginning. As the world replayed the images of burning aid, the US government made its move. In a hastily called press conference, officials revealed intercepted communications audio files, grainy videos, damning transcripts. The evidence was clear. Maduro's top generals had ordered the blockade, had given the command to use force, had laughed as the trucks burned. The world gasped. Allies who had stood by Maduro began to waver. The Organization of American States called for an emergency session. European leaders demanded accountability. Inside the Miraflores palace, the mood shifted from triumph to panic. Maduro's inner circle, once united by fear and loyalty, began to fracture. Some generals whispered of escape routes, of secret bank accounts in distant countries. Ministers argued behind closed doors, their voices rising in desperation. The regime's propaganda machine sputtered, unable to spin the images that now defined the crisis. Mad looked cornered. He appeared on television, his face drawn, his words defensive. He blamed foreign provocateurs, accused the opposition of staging the violence, insisted that Venezuela would never surrender. But the bravado rang hollow. The world had seen too much. The mask was slipping, and even his most loyal supporters could feel it. Meanwhile, Guaido seized the moment. He called for a national strike, urging workers to lay down their tools. To show the world that Venezuela's spirit could not be crushed, he visited hospitals, comforting mothers whose children had gone without medicine. He marched with students, his arm around a young woman who had lost her brother to the violence. He spoke not of revenge, but of reconciliation. "We are not here to destroy," he said, "but to rebuild. We are not here to hate, but to heal." The world responded. Messages of solidarity poured in from every corner of the globe. Celebrities tweeted their support. Human rights organizations demanded action. Even some of Maduro's former allies began to distance themselves, their statements growing cautious, their support conditional. The tide was turning and everyone could feel it. But the most powerful response came from ordinary Venezuelans. In the barrios, people banged pots and pans from their windows, a cacophony of defiance that echoed through the night. In the countryside, farmers formed human chains to protect aid convoys. In the cities, artists painted murals of hope on crumbling walls. The movement was no longer just about politics. It was about dignity, about survival, about reclaiming a future that had been stolen. As the flames from the border clash died down, a new fire was kindling in the hearts of millions. Guaido's courage had become contagious. The regime's violence had become its own undoing. The world was no longer asking if change would come. But when the real shock came not from the leaders, but from the people themselves, the border clash became more than a headline, it became a spark. Within hours, the world's digital pulse quickened. #Venezuela Libre shot to the top of trending lists, not just in Caracas or Miami, but in Seoul, Paris, Johannesburg, and beyond. Videos of the burning aid trucks, of Guaido's trembling hand raised in defiance, of mothers weeping and children chanting for freedom, ricocheted across every platform. The world was no longer just watching. It was participating in Los Angeles. A Venezuelan-American artist painted a mural overnight, her hands stained with the colors of her flag. In Madrid, students draped themselves in yellow, blue, and red, marching through the city center, their voices echoing off ancient stone. In Buenos Aires, a flash mob erupted in a plaza. Hundreds of strangers singing the Venezuelan anthem in unison, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. The movement was no longer confined by borders. It was a chorus, a wave, a force. Celebrities joined the outcry. A Grammy-winning singer posted a tearful video, urging her millions of followers to stand with the people of Venezuela. A Hollywood actor changed his profile picture to the Venezuelan flag. Athletes, authors, and activists from every continent added their voices, amplifying the call for justice. Politicians, too, could not ignore the groundswell. In the halls of Congress, impassioned speeches rang out, some demanding more action, others warning of unintended consequences. But the shockwaves were not all in support. The U.S., once hailed as a champion of democracy, now faced a barrage of criticism. Commentators questioned the wisdom of ultimatums and military posturing. Protesters gathered outside American embassies, holding signs that read "No more intervention" and "Let Venezuela decide." Editorials warned of repeating the mistakes of history, of turning a struggle for dignity into a geopolitical chess match. The world's sympathy for the Venezuelan people was clear, but so was its skepticism of foreign hands. Inside Venezuela, the regime's response was swift and brutal. Maduro's security forces swept through neighborhoods, arresting activists, raiding homes, and silencing journalists. The internet slowed to a crawl. Social media sites flickered and vanished, but the message could not be contained. People found new ways to connect: encrypted apps, pirate radio, whispered messages passed in the dark. The more the regime tried to clamp down, the more determined the resistance became. Protests erupted in places no one expected. In the oil fields of Zulia, workers walked off the job, their tools left in the dust. In the Andean highlands, indigenous communities blocked roads, demanding respect and recognition. In the heart of Caracas, a grandmother led a march, her cane tapping out a rhythm of defiance. The movement was leaderless and unstoppable, fueled by a hunger for change that no bullet or baton could quash. The world's media scrambled to keep up. News anchors spoke breathlessly of a Venezuelan spring. Analysts debated the next move, the risks, the stakes. Every hour brought new footage, new voices, new stories of courage and heartbreak. The crisis was no longer a distant tragedy, it was a living, breathing drama unfolding in real time, with millions of viewers invested in the outcome. Yet for all the hope, there was fear. The regime's crackdowns grew harsher. Night raids became common. Families disappeared. The price of defiance was high, and everyone knew it. But the people pressed on, their courage magnified by the world's gaze. They banged pots and pans. They painted slogans on walls. They sang songs of freedom in the face of tear gas and gunfire in Washington. The administration weighed its next steps. Caught between the urge to act and the fear of backlash, in Moscow and Beijing, leaders watched warily, calculating their interests. In the streets of Venezuela, the only calculation was survival and the hope that this time, the world would not look away. And as the world held its breath, a new question emerged. How far would each side go? In the quiet that followed the chaos, the world was left to reckon with what it had witnessed. The images of burning aid, of mothers clutching hungry children, crowds risking everything for a sliver of hope. These were not just the consequences of failed politics, it's the price of brinkmanship. The standoff between nations had become a crucible for ordinary people, testing the limits of endurance and the meaning of dignity. For every headline about sanctions or ultimatums, there were 1,000 untold stories. A nurse who walked miles to treat her neighbors, a teacher who taught lessons by candlelight, a father who sold his last possession to buy medicine for his child. These were the true faces of the crisis, the ones who bore the weight of decisions made in distant capitals. Their suffering was not a statistic, but a call to conscience, a reminder that the cost of power games is always paid by the powerless. Yet, even in the darkest moments, the yearning for self-determination burned bright. Guido, standing before a sea of faces, spoke not of vengeance, but of unity. "This is not just a fight for Venezuela," he declared, his voice steady and clear. "It is a fight for the right of every person to choose their own destiny, to live with dignity, to raise their children in peace." His words echoed far beyond the borders of his country, resonating with anyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unfree. The world, too, was forced to look inward. The crisis in Venezuela became a mirror, reflecting the choices and values of every nation. Would the powerful use their strength to uplift or to oppress? Would the international community stand by as a people suffered, or would it find the courage to act with compassion and wisdom? The answers were not simple, But the questions could no longer be ignored. In living rooms from Caracas to Chicago, families debated what justice looked like. In classrooms, students asked why some voices mattered more than others. On social media, strangers from different continents found common cause, united by a belief that dignity is not a privilege, but a right. The story of Venezuela became a test of global conscience, a challenge to see the humanity in every struggle, and to remember that borders cannot contain the longing for freedom. As the dust settled, the hero's message lingered. We are not defined by the darkness we endure, but by the light we choose to create. It was a call to action, not just for Venezuelans, but for anyone who believes in the power of hope over fear, of justice over oppression, of unity over division. But the story of Venezuela and the world's response is still being written. The standoff between the United States and Venezuela is more than a contest of power. It's a test of our collective humanity. Tonight, we've seen how brinkmanship can push a nation to the edge, how ordinary people pay the price for decisions made in distant rooms, and how the yearning for dignity and self-determination can ignite a movement that echoes far beyond any border. This is not just Venezuela's story. It's a warning, a lesson, and a call to action for all of us. The dangers of confrontation are real, but so is the hope that comes when people refuse to be silenced. In every protest, every act of courage, every voice raised for justice, we see the truth. The future is not written by the powerful alone, but by those who dare to demand something better. If you believe in the power of dignity over division, if you see yourself in the faces of those who march for freedom, then this is your moment too. Join the conversation. Share this story. Stand up for justice and peace, not just for Venezuela, but for every community where voices are threatened and hope is under siege. History is watching. Will you be a bystander or a voice for dignity? Subscribe, share, and let your voice be heard. The story isn't over. It's just beginning, and you are part of it.